So I'll try to give the context for the last session. Hey Rishabh, hi. I was actually very excited to start the next article, which is Bitcoin cannot be banned, but this is a pretty lengthy article. Bitcoin is not a pyramid scheme, and the overall context for this article is that it focuses on specifically what makes Bitcoin distinct from any pyramid scheme. This is the background with which it started. So it started with the background that a lot of the times, because Bitcoin has resiliency in its supply, and because of greater increase of adoption, there is increase in price. A lot of people, when they talk about why Bitcoin is the best store of wealth and it will help you preserve purchasing power in the future, it might sound like you're shilling a pyramid scheme because that's how typically pyramid schemes advertise themselves. But once you understand how Bitcoin works and how it is fundamentally different from pyramid schemes, you understand that Bitcoin's value proposition is entirely different. And the overall of it is that the pyramid scheme relies on people attracting other people and attracting them to increase the supply of whatever token or product that they are selling. In case of Bitcoin, that is not true because the supply cap of Bitcoin is hard coded into its consensus, and no matter how many people or how much energy goes into the system, the supply of blocks and the overall supply of Bitcoin remains constant. So pretty basic stuff if you're not new to Bitcoin. So what I'll be doing is that I'll try to cover this article within the next 20-30 minutes, and then we'll try to start the next pieces and also give the context of the overall book in the next pieces. So the book, how it has evolved is it started off with explaining why Bitcoin is distinct from every other cryptocurrency and not blockchain. I mean, it's not blockchain is just one component of Bitcoin's overall architecture, and then it went into the technical details of how Bitcoin supply is fixed. And then in this article, we conclude with understanding the first principles of Bitcoin and especially focusing on the unit of account function of money. And one context from the last session was regarding the famous analogy or concept of Bitcoin being a knowledge distribution system. And that means that whenever there is a price signal in the economy, it signals to every individual, every market actor on how to act according to that price signal. So whenever there is distortion in money, there is distortion in distribution of information, and what that does is just give bad information or falsified information to individuals, which creates all sorts of malinvestments and disruption and overall decrease in value and standards of living. So I'll start from here, and we'll try to cover it within the next 30 minutes. Yep. So thank you for joining. Hi, X Guy. Let's start. Distortion of the price system. In our current system, the supply of money changes unpredictably and increases over time. This is core to the central banking monetary model, and it derives from monetarist economic theory, which argues that an active management of the money supply stimulates aggregate demand and ultimately promotes full employment. What it technically does is manipulate interest rates downward by increasing the supply of money. Lower interest rate increase the willingness and incentive to borrow. However, all else being equal, a lower interest would otherwise decrease the willingness to lend. So these are pretty technical terms which I think are used in Keynesian economics a lot, which is that the role of the central bank is to stimulate aggregate demand, because according to them, this is what creates uh, increase in price, and it is necessary, otherwise the economy will stall. And they go into all sorts of weird arguments of why, if there is no inflation and there is no stimulation of aggregate demand, the market will halt into a recession and eventually a depression. And the reason that they say that it is important is to promote full employment. So the next article especially uh, the next article covers the dilemma of why it is not full employment versus inflation. It is the dilemma of I'm not able to recall the exact concept. I'll try to cover it once after the session. I'll share the relevant context. I'm not able to recall it right now, but I hope it was clear that the The theoretical explanation of money supply is the stimulation of aggregate demand, and why it is done is to promote full employment. And how it is technically done is by manipulating interest rates. Lower interest rate increase the willingness incentive to borrow. However, all else being equal, a lower interest would otherwise decrease the willingness to lend. Essentially, by inflating the money supply, the central bank artificially manipulates the function of credit, creating a sustained imbalance between the incentive to borrow and the willingness to lend. The more pervasive consequence is the distortion of the pricing mechanism that coordinates economic activity. By manipulating the supply of money and the supply of credit, central banks distort all prices across the market. All signals about inflation are distributed to all market participants. So yeah, so any attempt at manipulating interest rates is essentially artificially creating a distortion in the supply and demand dynamics. And how it is technically done is by lowering the interest rates by creating more money into the economy. So wherever there is less incentive to borrow, the central banks create that artificially by decreasing the interest rates. And how they do it is by allowing banks to create new money into supply. So essentially, it creates more incentive to borrow than to lend, and that creates all sorts of imbalances because unless two individuals are willing to get into the contract of willingly borrowing and lending, there is no incentive for anybody else to. There is no incentive left for them if anybody else to tries to intervene in that free market activity. The entire supply and demand structure of the economy becomes distorted as hundreds of millions of people respond to manipulated price signals, and when resources within the economy are reallocated based on those signals. When the money supply is increased, new money and credit enters the system through various channels and at unpredictable times. The quantity and rate of change is unknown to most market participants. Instead, the market participants react to price signals. That is how information is communicated. A price signal may be the cost of a good at the supermarket, or it may be a salary an employer is willing to pay for a certain job. The change in the money supply creates a distortion of prices, such that market participants cannot effectively understand whether changes in price are driven by changes in underlying supply and demand structures, or to what extent changes in price are merely a function of more or less money in the system. Regardless, everyone reacts to distorted signals. So the overall of this paragraph is that market participants are not in the position to understand the exact dynamics of how money supply expansion or decrease of money supply creates the distortion. But what it does is creates distortion in the price signal, and which is ultimately the action, the thing that allows them to take any action. So this they are only able to respond to the information given to them through the price, which is distorted because of the artificial suppression of demand and supply. For a more tangible example, the Fed purchased 1.7 trillion of mortgage-backed securities, 17% of all mortgages, following the financial crisis as part of its quantitative easing program, which ultimately increased the base money supply by 3.6 trillion. Most people recall that prior to the financial crisis, there was a housing bubble. By directly purchasing mortgages and by inflating the money supply, the Fed manipulated interest rates lower. Housing relies heavily on the supply of credit and ultimately on the cost of interest. With lower interest rates and more money available to lend, housing prices were manipulated higher. As a result, distorted price signals were sent to both buyers and sellers. Developers of housing respond by building more homes, and buyers of home believe they can take on more debt at lower rates to purchase homes. So yeah, so in the financial crisis of 2008, there was this imbalance in the housing market, which happened because of lower interest rates than what free market would have allowed by the central bank. And it was done again by allowing the increase of money supply by lowering the rate of interest rate artificially. And what it did is that it created an incentive for people to borrow more and to build more houses than there is demand for that. Then there is demand for people to lend, and then there is demand for people to build homes to make profit. So what it did as a result, distorted price signals were sent to both buyers and sellers. Developers of housing respond by building more homes, increasing supply, and buyers of homes believe they can take on more debt at lower rates to purchase homes. More resources in the economy are devoted to the function of housing because of higher price levels. However, any increase in demand can only be sustained so long as the cost of credit is continually manipulated downward as a function of an increasing money supply. Yep. So, so what essentially expansion of money supply by lowering the interest rate does is that it creates artificial demand, because now there is more incentive to borrow than there was before, right? Because otherwise, two people engaging in lending and borrowing will only do that when both of them are better off by exchanging that value. But when there is artificially lowering of interest rates, then there is more incentive for borrowers to borrow more money. What that does is that more resources in the economy, which are scarce, are devoted to one section of the economy, which in the case of 2008 was the housing market. And what it does is that it increases in demand of that specific section of the economy. But it can only be sustained as long as the cost of credit is continuously manipulated downward as a function of an increasing money supply. Because it was unnatural, it wouldn't have been sustained by the practice of free market. Wasn't there the intervention of the central bank? I don't know what this graph exactly represents, but this is the US National Home Price Index. I, yeah, if anybody has any inputs on this, please do share. This is the US Home Price Index, which has been calculated till 2018 or 19 in this article. Despite wide recognition of the unsustainable housing bubble in 2007, the National Home Price Index is now 15% higher than it was at the prior peak. So right. So this is important to understand that even though the housing bubble was unsustainable in 2007, that what that means is that there was more artificial demand than there was supply to cater to that demand. So essentially, what it did it that because there was this signal of artificial demand, there was more houses being built than number of people who are actually finding value in buying it in a very simple terms. So what it created oversupply of housing. So essentially, it's an imbalance that was created in the economy. When there is oversupply of any good or service than there is demand for it, it will suffer through negative prices, or it will suffer through losses for the people who are building those resources or those houses in this case. Interestingly, what it did is that the national home price index is still 15% higher than it was at the prior peak. So this is unnatural, right? That this shouldn't be still higher than what the prior peak was, because if this is unsustained, then naturally the market should correct itself and reflect the correct demand and supply of the housing market. This is the manipulation of price levels on full display, and it happens as an intended function of central bank monetary policy. The Fed increases the money supply, lowers interest rates, and inflates asset prices such that the amount of existing debt in the credit system can be sustained. I think this is also interesting, and I'll try to explain what that exactly means. Is that of course the Fed increases money supply by lowering interest rates, and what it does is that the asset prices get inflated. So most asset owners have this sense that they are increasing their purchasing power by owning those assets. And what it essentially allows the system to do is to create more existing debt. And if you can recall the previous sessions from this article series, and in general also, if you're aware that the entire monetary system of the fiat currency is monetized by creating more debt by the government. So it allows more debt to be created, which essentially keeps the musical chairs running. Because otherwise, if there is not more debt created every year, then there will have to be repayment of debt, which is impossible because there is more debt than there is the supply of money in the economy. So, in order to be able to keep the system sustainable, there needs to be creation of debt more than the year prior. Credit expansion is the Fed's objective in stimulating growth, and net new credit cannot be created unless existing debt levels can be sustained, which is why the Fed must inflate asset prices to achieve its objectives. Asset prices support existing debt levels. When everyone figures out that the price signals are unsustainable and unreliable, it causes a shock to the system. This is what happened in 2007, and it is likely to happen again as the market signals have become even further distorted. Right. So asset prices and how they are increasing, it supports the existing debt levels. And my understanding of it is that because there is more collateral that can back the debt, more people are incentivized to create more debt and get deeper into debt, because in their value assessment, their asset prices are growing. And what that does is, again, it creates a unsustainable and unreliable market, because this borrowing of debt is being artificially created by lowering of interest rates. And if it wasn't for that artificial intervention, the market would have course corrected its signal in the economy. So what it does, it because price signals are unsustainable, at some point it will cause a shock to the system, because at some point there will be more supply than there is real demand for those goods and services. And at one point, someone will not be buying whatever asset that is supposedly increasing in value. And yeah, the system broke down in 2007 very glaringly by defaulting of some of the major banks, and it is likely to happen again as the market signals have become even further distorted. And the example of it is that is mentioned here, that the national home price index is now even 15% higher than the prior peak. So there is still more artificial demand for housing than the natural free market would have allowed. But it is not some evil scheme. The Fed is not a purposively malicious actor. The Fed ultimately intends to promote full employment through its policies. What it actually does is manipulate relative price signals, which creates imbalances in the underlying supply and demand structures of the economy, creating sudden and more chronic unemployment. Yep. So I think this is something that even for me was something to digest or realize, that it's not, the Fed at this point is not some evil scheme that somebody is running as the puppet masters of the economy. It has become a self fulfilling prophecy that they have to increase the money supply by creating more debt. And no matter who is at the helm of the chair of the Federal Reserve in its mandate is supposed to increase the money supply, because at least on paper, their mandate is to create full employment, and that can only happen in a debt-based monetary system, which is unsustainable, which has created more debt than it can pay off by creating more debt into the future and by siphoning wealth from the savers. And what it does is it creates underlying imbalance in the underlying supply and demand structure of the economy, which ultimately creates sudden and chronic unemployment. So it fails to fulfill its own mandated promise of full employment. Hayek, Hayek spoke on this subject in his 1974 Nobel Prize winning speech, The Pretense of Knowledge. As a function of manipulated prices, more resources are devoted to a segment of the economy than could otherwise be sustained naturally. When the central bank changes the course of its monetary policy, prices begin to respond and the market corrects. Because price levels have been manipulated on a sustained basis, a demand shock becomes inevitable and everyone figures out imbalances exist. In the case of the housing example, supply, both of goods and labor, significantly exceeds sustainable demand at current price levels. More broadly, imbalances are everywhere. It becomes apparent that supply and demand are significantly out of balance and unemployment increases rapidly. The market cannot find an equilibrium because all markets have been manipulated on a sustained basis for extended periods of time. I'll take a quick pause. Hi, Bala. Yeah. So I'll quickly read this again. I think my screen wasn't shared. This is what occurred, and in the during and in the aftermath of the financial crisis. It was the boiling over point after the Fed had manipulated the supply of money and the supply of credit for decades. As portrayed in The Big Short, the financial crisis often gets blamed on the subprime crisis, but the not often discussed 800-pound gorilla in the room is central bank monetary policy. Following the crisis, the Fed responded by pursuing the same policy action it had pursued for decades, but on a much greater scale. It massively increased the money supply, further manipulating price signals. When the money supply is manipulated, recognize that not all price levels. I think just to highlight this point of this paragraph is that when the money supply is manipulated, recognize that not all price levels respond ratably, which means that it's not some mathematical equation that whenever money supply increases, chasing the same number of goods and services, that all goods and services will have their prices increase in equal proportion. But it happens that whenever money supply increases, it does so in a few sections of the economy, which will be the people who are able to borrow that new money into existence at a much lower interest rate than everyone else, and chasing some particular goods and services which will have greater demand for the same supply and their price being increased. So there is no, and what it does is it trickles down into the economy at different points without there being there being one cardinal way of calculating how exactly that affects the market, other than the fact that it will create more distortion. Money enters the system through different channels, and the expansion of credit impacts certain segment of the economy more than others. All prices are manipulated, but not equally. It is fundamentally the distortion of relative prices which disrupt the underlying supply and demand function of a market. Price communicates information. It is how market participants communicate what they value on a relative basis, and it is how all market participants then respond to those preferences on the supply side. What skills people train themselves with, what businesses people choose to build, what employment opportunities people seek. The Fed may not intend to do harm by manipulating the money supply, but ultimately it is the unavoidable consequence of distorting the price mechanism within an economy. Yep, yep. I think the important point that I want to highlight here is that the price is the only thing that market participants are forced to respond to, and there is no methodology or framework that an individual can come up with to understand those distortions, other than just realizing that there is a distortion. What it does is that this creates this whole musical chairs game. I've been giving this example over and over again, where people are forced to play within those dynamics because price is the only information which they can respond to. Yeah. Quick pause, then I'll start. Yep. Predictability of the money supply. Bitcoin is the white knight, or at least it has the potential to be. By creating a fixed supply, Bitcoin has the potential to be the greatest pricing mechanism the world has ever known. Once Bitcoin reaches its maximum supply of 21 million, changes to the money supply will be removed entirely from the equation of price signals. It should be axiomatic that the creation of money does nothing to generate real economic activity. It doesn't matter whether the changes in the money supply is predictably small or whether the money supply increases significantly and unpredictably. Printing money does nothing to generate economic activity, it serves to distort supply and demand. The utility of money is in exchange, whether present exchange, future exchange, that is all. Money is not consumed, it is used to coordinate the economic activity that allows for capital to be accumulated, whether it be physical capital required to produce real goods or human capital which advances arts, science, mathematics, etc. That capital is the true savings of a society and it is fundamental to the function of an economy. Most people think of savings in monetary terms because money is a unit of account, but real savings is represented by the accumulated capital that enriches the lives of individuals, families, and communities. In a world with a fixed money supply, monetary savings would be constant. Money would transfer from individual to individual, family to family, or business to business, but in total, the money supply would neither increase or decrease. Economic activity would be coordinated as a function of money and with an undistorted pricing mechanism. I think one simple analogy to understand this is just imagining money as a ruler or a scale, and value being the thing that that scale allows us to measure. And because now money has a fixed supply within the Bitcoin monetary policy, then you can use it to measure the value of everything else in the economy and coordinate economic activity based on that. So any market participant, individual, business owner, or family can now calculate the expenditure and the production cost for anything that they engage in without having to factor in the possibility of that scale being distorted because the money supply itself becomes a constant. And it goes without saying that any um, change in that money supply itself does nothing to affect the real economy, and if it does at all, it does it in the negative. The aggregate preferences of all markets would be more accurately communicated without the distortion of a changing money supply. Imbalances in supply and demand would be naturally corrected and not sustained over long periods of time. As a consequence, imbalances would also be smaller and not systemic to the economy as a whole. It does not mean all prices would always be perfect or that other variables such as government spending or taxes could not influence or distort economic activity. However, it would eliminate the primary mechanism that distorts price signals and market structures. I think, and this could just be my opinion, I want to highlight the fact that Bitcoin being the unit of account in the economy does not necessarily mean that government will not exist or taxes will not exist. It just means that there will not be the price signal distortion in the money supply itself. And because of that, everything else in the economy will not be unsustained as it is currently to the scale that it is. So there will still be disruptions locally because of change in supply and demand dynamics, and because of fractional reserve in that economy, and because of government intervention that will inevitably result in all sorts of distortion. It will not be distortion of the money system systemically. So there will be no one economy that gets disrupted because of some action of some group of individuals, because Bitcoin itself cannot be distorted or its fixed supply can never be changed. Bitcoin's fixed supply is the foundation of its more reliable pricing system, but it is also issued at a predictable rate. In the future state, when Bitcoin reaches its maximum supply, the rate of change thereafter will be zero. But on its way to that future state, Bitcoin embeds a stable and predictable supply schedule, which is a distinct and equally important part of the equation. Bitcoin are issued through a mining process that helps to secure the network, and the network adjusts to ensure that Bitcoin are issued on average every 10 minutes. If more mining resources are added to the network adjusts to prevent Bitcoin from being issued at a faster rate. More mining results in greater levels of network security rather than increasing the rate of issuance or increasing the total amount of Bitcoin that will ultimately be issued. This allows the entire economic system to plan for the future. It allows miners building security infrastructure to forecast future compensation, but it also allows all market participants to predictably know the rate of change of the currency at any point in time. Yep. So it's not just that Bitcoin has a fixed supply. Of course, it also has a predictable rate of issuance, and it allows for market participants to be able to predictably make estimations of the entire monetary network within the Bitcoin system at least. So of course there are external variables, and everybody in the Bitcoin ecosystem have to account for it, be it miners or individual users of Bitcoin. But Bitcoin system itself is predictable to the extent that is possible. Rather than allowing Bitcoin to be issued rapidly or at an unpredictable rate, the network ensures that Bitcoin will be issued steadily over time and, as a consequence, on a more distributed basis. Most importantly, it constantly reinforces the credibility of the overall issuance structure. Every 10 minutes on average, a certain number of Bitcoin are issued. Approximately every 4 years, that number is cut in half until ultimately no incremental Bitcoin will be issued. On the path to 21 million, the enforcement of the fixed supply every 10 minutes builds credibility in the future state supply over time. All market participants come to understand that the fixed supply will be enforced not because of a magical point in time when the maximum is actually reached, but instead because the network enforces its monetary policy every 10 minutes. Yep. So it's not so how the fixed supply is credibly enforced in the Bitcoin network is by enforcing the consensus every 10 minutes, which is by issuance of a block, a valid block, and verification of that block by every node in the network. So I think I'll just want to stress on this line that all market participants come to understand the fixed supply will be enforced not because of a magical point in time when the maximum is actually reached, but instead because the network enforces its monetary policy every 10 minutes. By creating a predictable supply schedule, the rate of change predictably decreases, and all market participants can observe for themselves that the system is functioning as intended. One quick pause. I'll also just quickly check how much of this article is remaining. The titles are Monetary Policy by Consensus versus Central Bank, and I think. Mm, yep. I'll start reading monetary policy by consensus versus central bank. This process, which constantly reinforces the credibility of Bitcoin's monetary system, is occurring in parallel to the dysfunction of the legacy monetary systems. Central banks everywhere are increasing the money supply of their respective economies at an unpredictable rate. As discussed previously, the Fed increased the money supply in the US by 3.6 trillion following the financial crisis from 2008 to 2014. Despite the Fed forecasting its plans, no one knew what the total would ultimately be. Everyone was guessing. The Fed didn't even know. After increasing money supply by several multiples, the Fed then began removing $50 billion from the economy each month, a process which began in October 2017. Again, no one knew exactly how much money would actually be removed from the system in total or for how long. In aggregate, approximately 700 billion in base money was removed over the course of approximately 2 years. And now, as of October 2019, the Fed has once again shifted course and has begun to add more money into the system. Just recently, the Fed signaled plans to add $60 billion to the financial system each month, planned for the next 6 months. But once again, no one really knows for how long this will go on or whether the amounts will change. Realistically, the Fed does not know because it is impossible to know. Yeah. I think it's a pretty nice irony that this was in 2019 and the amount of money printing and expansion of money supply that has happened post 2019, especially in the post 2020 era, is beyond what one could have imagined in 2019. And this line summarizes it that realistically the Fed does not know because it is impossible to know. All we practically know is that from this point forward, the money supply will increase and by a lot. But recognize most market participants have no idea any of this has occurred or is occurring. All market participants really know is what is communicated to them via prices and employment opportunities. Those that have an understanding of the Fed's action may be in a better position to forecast or predict the directional consequences. But economic systems are complex. We all react to the pricing mechanisms around us, and no one has anywhere close to perfect knowledge. This is the pretense of knowledge. The aggregate knowledge of millions of people is communicated through price, which is ultimately a function of ever changing preferences of the individuals that make up an economy. Individuals are inherently limited in the knowledge they possess, and this is certainly true of central banks. In the central banking monetary model, 12 individuals or thereabout determine how and when to create billions, if not trillions, of dollars despite possessing inherently limited knowledge. No matter how well intentioned or how much knowledge possessed, the net consequence is the distortion of the fundamental mechanism, that is, the pricing mechanism, which aggregates knowledge possessed by the market as a whole. For everyone relying upon the dollar as a unit of account and as a mechanism to communicate economic trade offs, the very foundation changes unpredictably, unbeknownst to most of its participants. Distorted price signals are communicated gradually through millions of markets, impacting the decisions made by hundreds of millions, and the centralized mechanism that dictates monetary policy is a root cause of this distortion. Yep, yep. To summarize, as we have discussed a few times, that pricing mechanism is the distribution of knowledge system in the economy because any individual and any group of individuals also realistically can only act on the price as the signal to act and change their preferences, change their behavior, take up new businesses and new adventures, and also their spending patterns. And whenever there is distortion of money supply, it causes people to force to act on those bad and false information. And even if a reasonable person believed active money supply management to be a net benefit, Bitcoin is now operating alongside the legacy monetary system, a decentralized system versus a centralized system, monetary policy by consensus versus monetary policy by central bank. While the money supply of the legacy system is unpredictably changing, the Bitcoin network is operating flawlessly with a known supply and with a predictable rate of change. Rather than it being a philosophical or economic debate, there are now two competing systems and the market will have the last say. Right. So yeah, so I think it goes without saying that if anybody has a problem with Bitcoin's monetary policy, then it it has the option to choose to opt to any other monetary policy, and the market will decide ultimately which monetary policy is superior. While Bitcoin is maybe complicated and the very subject of money may not be well understood, the flaws in the existing system are independent of Bitcoin. The 17 trillion of negative yielding debt should be evidence enough, and it only exists as a direct consequence of central bank monetary policy. Ultimately, the currencies that support the legacy system will be the release valve because central banks will be forced to increase the money supply in order to sustain what is an otherwise unsustainable credit system. Yeah. So with the legacy system coordinated by central banks, all one can rely on is that money supply will change at unpredictable rates. With Bitcoin, everyone can verify the supply and the predictable rate of change. By running a Bitcoin full node, anyone can verify the number of Bitcoin that exist in circulation and the amount of new Bitcoin issued in each block. Anyone and everyone can verify this information without trusting anyone else. This is how Bitcoin works. Each node not only verifies information, it also validates information independently. Bitcoin's monetary policy is enforced on a decentralized basis by all nodes within the network. With precision, everyone can calculate when future blocks will be solved and when the rate of issuance will change. The fact that everyone can verify and validate the money supply, regardless of the nominal amount, reinforces the credibility of the monetary system. This reinforcement occurs every 10 minutes, 6 times an hour, 144 times a day, 6,320 times a month, 52,560 times a year, with each passing Bitcoin block. The monetary system hardens as market participants validate that the monetary policy is enforced over and over again every 10 minutes. This is the supply and rate of issuance verified on a 4-year-old laptop, Apple laptop. The total supply was at the time 17 million. The block subsidy was 12.5 Bitcoin. A fixed supply is of little meaning without the credibility of its enforcement. Anyone can copy Bitcoin's architecture and code base, but what cannot be replicated is the credibility of its monetary properties. The consensus mechanism which governs Bitcoin is the foundation of its credibility and what ultimately sets Bitcoin apart from its competition. Even if an individual remained unconvinced that a currency with a fixed supply would communicate better information through its pricing mechanism, it does not matter what any individual believes. Bitcoin entrusts its monetary policy to a consensus mechanism. While the maximum supply of Bitcoin is practically capped at 21 million, the supply is ultimately governed by a consensus of those that hold Bitcoin as a currency. If the market, which unquestionably possesses more information than any individual, collectively determined that it would be better to change the supply schedule rather than implementing a fixed cap, it is theoretically possible. However, the market would have to come to an overwhelming consensus to effect that change. And practically speaking, a decentralized network of rational economic actors would not form an overwhelming consensus to debase its own currency. Bitcoin's monetary policy is flexible enough to change, but it is impossible to do so without an overwhelming consensus. Bitcoin ultimately represents the contrast between monetary policy by consensus and monetary policy by central bank. The information possessed by a market consensus mechanism will always exceed that of a small number of individuals, which is why Bitcoin outcompetes the legacy system at every step. Bitcoin is not a pyramid scheme. So no, Bitcoin is not a pyramid scheme. It is not organized by a sketchy company pushing high pressure sales tactics. It is not peddling some inferior consumer good with abundant supply where compensation is directly tied to recruiting new members to the scheme. Bitcoin is money and its supply is finitely scarce. It does not matter how many people adopt Bitcoin. As adoption increases, the same pie is distributed across more and more people. And so, on average, more people control a smaller and smaller share of the network. Its value increases as a function of adoption, and adoption is increasing because its monetary properties are superior to the competition. Bitcoin has a fixed supply, its supply schedule is predictable, and its monetary policy is governed and enforced by consensus. Bitcoin's pricing mechanism is unmanipulatable and cannot be distorted because of its fixed supply. everything changes around Bitcoin, but Bitcoin's fixed supply is the constant. Because Bitcoin supply is fixed and cannot be manipulated, it will eventually become the most reliable pricing mechanism in the world and consequently the greatest distribution system of knowledge. That is the promise which Bitcoin provides, and it will only proliferate if it creates utility for those that adopt it. Today and into future, the utility will continue to be the ability to reliably store wealth in a monetary medium that cannot be debased. When people make the claim that Bitcoin could be bigger than the internet, it is generally not a linear application, but instead rooted in the idea that a sovereign, unmanipulatable form of money has the potential to be one of the greatest instruments of freedom ever invented. Success of Bitcoin is not a given, but if successful in delivering on its promise, it will facilitate more effective and more peaceable coordination by and amongst people throughout the world. At the end of the day, Bitcoin is a communication tool. That is the function of money. Bitcoin simply provides an alternative system operating on a decentralized basis, which no one controls. It is the lack of control and the lack of conscious direction which will allow Bitcoin to accumulate and communicate knowledge more effectively than any pre existing monetary medium. Current volatility is nothing more than the logical path of price discovery as adoption increases exponentially over time and as we advance toward that future state of adoption. This is from Hayek in The Counter Revolution of Science. Many of the greatest things man has achieved are the result not of consciously directed thought, and still less the product of a deliberately coordinated effort of many individuals, but of a process in which the individual plays a part which he can never fully understand. They are greater than any individual because they result from the combination of knowledge more extensive than a single mind master. We have reached the end of this article, Bitcoin on a Pyramid Scheme. We'll take a 1 minute pause. I've been going on for a while. If somebody wants to share anything general about anything, please feel free to share. I think we can try to cover the next piece, which is Bitcoin cannot be banned. It's a pretty entertaining piece. If somebody has not read it before, we'll start it in about 30 to 40 seconds. I think this font size should be good. Hmm. Somebody is the stream visible to everyone? Yes, Dhruval. So the stream is
Yeah,
visible to,
visible.
I think it's on Twitter, and anybody who will see Bitshala's tweet on their timeline can see the stream on Twitter itself.
I think he's referring to the stream on Discord as well. So can you scroll up and down? Is the screen frozen?
Oh,
Are you scrolling?
no, no. Okay, yeah,
Yeah, no, it's not frozen. It's working.
right. I think yeah, I lost connection for a while, so he might have messaged at that time. Is that the case, Dhruval?
Yeah. So I reconnected and it was visible again.
Okay. Yeah, I lost connection for a while, so might be because of my internet. Yeah. So let's start. We'll go on for about 10 to 15 minutes. We will take a hard pause at 9. Sorry. Yeah, 9. Uh, yeah, 9:05. Sorry. The idea that somehow Bitcoin can be banned by governments is the final stage of grief right before acceptance. The consequence of the statement is an admission that Bitcoin works. In fact, it posits that Bitcoin works so well that it will threaten the incumbent government run monopolies on money, in which case governments will regulate it out of existence to eliminate the threat. Think about the claim that governments will ban Bitcoin as a conditional logic. Is Bitcoin functional as money? If not, governments have nothing to ban. If yes, then governments will attempt to ban Bitcoin. So the anchor point for this line of criticism assumes that Bitcoin is functional as money, and then the question becomes whether or not government intervention could successfully cause an otherwise functioning Bitcoin to fail. So I think the question very clearly is one of competence, that if Bitcoin is not functional as money, then there is nothing to ban. There's no reason for somebody to ban something which is not functional. But if it is, then the question becomes, can government ban Bitcoin? As a starting point, anyone trying to understand how Bitcoin works should assess the question entirely independent from the implications of government regulation or intervention. While Bitcoin will undoubtedly have to coexist alongside various regulatory regimes, imagine governments did not exist. On a standalone basis, would Bitcoin be functional as money if left to the free market? This will inevitably lead to a number of rabbit hole questions. What is money? What are the properties that make a particular medium a better or worse form of money? Does Bitcoin share those properties? Is Bitcoin a better form of money based on its properties? If the ultimate conclusion becomes that Bitcoin is not functional as money, the implications of government intervention are irrelevant. However, if Bitcoin is functional as money, the question then becomes relevant to the debate, and anyone considering the question would need that prior context as a baseline to evaluate whether or not it would be possible. Right. So again, to summarize, the implications of government intervention are relevant only when Bitcoin is clearly functioning in the free market. Right. So if there was no, just as a thought experiment, if there was no government and Bitcoin is functioning, then the only reason for them to ban it will be when it is already serving a purpose, when it is functioning as money for individuals to use it. The question then becomes relevant to the debate of whether or not government intervention is relevant. And anyone considering the question would need that prior context as a baseline to evaluate whether or not it would be possible. By design, Bitcoin exists beyond governments, but Bitcoin is not just beyond the control of governments, it functions without the coordination of any central third parties. It is global and decentralized. Anyone can access Bitcoin on a permissionless basis, and the more widespread it becomes, the more difficult it becomes to censor the network. The architecture of Bitcoin is practically purpose built to resist and immunize any attempts by governments to ban it. This is not to say that governments all over the world will not attempt to regulate, tax, or even ban its use. There will certainly be a fight to resist Bitcoin adoption. The Fed and the Treasury and their global counterparts are not just going to lay down as Bitcoin increasingly threatens the monopolies of government money. However, before debunking the idea that governments could outright ban Bitcoin, first understand the very consequence of the statement and the messenger. The progression of denial and stages of grief. The skeptic's narrative consistently shifts over time. Stage 1 of grief, Bitcoin could never work, it is backed by nothing. It is nothing more than a present day tulip mania. With each hype cycle, the value of Bitcoin rises dramatically and is then followed by a correction. Often extolled as a crash by skeptics, Bitcoin fails to die, and in each instance, it finds support at levels higher than prior adoption waves. The tulip narrative becomes tired, and the skeptics move on to more nuanced issues, re anchoring the debate. Stage 2 of grief follows. Bitcoin is flawed as a currency. It is too volatile to be money, or it is too slow to be a payment system, or it cannot scale to satisfy all the payments in the world, or it wastes energy. The list goes on. The second step is a progression of denial, and it is a significant departure from the idea that Bitcoin is nothing more than nothingness. Right. So yeah, so the progression of denial and stages of grief goes like this: that the first stage was that most people do not look at Bitcoin very seriously. They think that it's not backed by anything, and with each hype cycle, this continuously proves empirically wrong that more and more people are valuing it. And put very simply, price can also be a good signal for somebody to understand that Bitcoin is being valued by more and more individuals in every long enough time frame. And so the entire debate and its anchor point changes, and what it becomes is more of how Bitcoin, even though it is being valued, is flawed, and the arguments that they come up with, that it's volatile, too slow, cannot scale, waste energy. Despite the supposed flaws, the value of Bitcoin network continues to rise over time. Each time it does not die, it gains strength. While the skeptics are busy pointing out flaws, Bitcoin never sleeps. An increase in value is driven by a very simple market dynamic: more buyers than sellers. That is all, and it is a function of increasing adoption. More and more people figure out why there is fundamental demand for Bitcoin and why or how it works. This is what creates long-term demand for Bitcoin. As more people increasingly demand it as a store of wealth, there is no supply response. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin, no matter how much supply increases. Inelastic, as the skeptics continue to shout the same tired lines, the crowd continues to parse the noise and demand Bitcoin due to the strength of its monetary properties. And no constituency is more well versed in the arguments against Bitcoin than adopters of Bitcoin themselves. So I really know about this. I know that there are Bitcoin FUD dices, which I think I saw one very recently, and yeah, it's pretty nice to watch. Desperation begins to kick in, and the debate re-anchors once again. The narrative predictably shifts. It is no longer that Bitcoin is not backed by anything, nor that it is flawed as a currency. Instead, the debate centers on regulation and government authorities. In the final stage of grief, it is actually that Bitcoin works too well, and as a consequence, the government will never let it happen and ban it. Really? So human ingenuity somehow reinvents money in a technologically superior medium, the consequence of which are mind bending, and the government is somehow going to ban it. Can that recognize that in claiming as such, the skeptics are admitting defeat? It is the dying whimper in a series of failed arguments. The skeptics simultaneously accept that there is fundamental demand for Bitcoin and then pivot to the unfounded belief that governments can ban it. The internet lingo for it is coping, that once their couple of the last couple of stages of grief are done and dusted, that since Bitcoin is being used more and more individuals as a currency, as money, as a store of wealth, then it's proved increasingly wrong that it is flawed as a currency, and clearly it's not. It is backed by something which is individuals using it. So what happens is desperation begins to kick in, and what they try to do is get into that bargaining stage that they want some authority to have control over it or to ban it. And yeah, this article or this paragraph highlights that when they are doing that, they are already admitting defeat, because there is enough value in Bitcoin for individuals to be using it. So the response that they have is coping, which is trying to ban something which is valuable and and free market based. With this, there's no reason that this will be given up by individuals who already value it. Play this one out. When exactly would developed world governments actually step in and attempt to ban Bitcoin? Today, the Fed and the Treasury do not view Bitcoin as a serious threat to dollar supremacy. In their collective mind, Bitcoin is a cute little toy and is not functional as a currency. Presently, the Bitcoin network represents a total purchasing power of less than 200 billion. Gold, on the other hand, has a purchasing power of approximately 8 trillion, 40 times the size of Bitcoin. Broad money supply of dollars, M2, is approximately 15 trillion, 75 times the size of Bitcoin. When does the Fed or Treasury start seriously considering Bitcoin a credible threat? Is it when Bitcoin collectively represents 1 trillion of purchasing power, 2 trillion, or 3 trillion? Pick your level. But the implication is that Bitcoin will be far more valuable and held by far more people globally before government powers that be view it as a credible competitor or threat. Yep. And just to quickly tell the numbers on this, that it represents total purchasing power of less than 200 billion. I think now in 2024 it's slightly over 1.3 trillion. I'm not sure, but I think it's somewhere in that order. And yeah, so it clearly still has a long way to go before even beating something as opaque and as redundant as gold, in terms of settlement of its value. And yeah, and broad money supply is also 75 times of Bitcoin just in 2019. So yeah, so the point that this article or this paragraph is highlighting here is that whatever level you think that Bitcoin has become so big that it is threatening the system, it reinforces the point that at this point there are enough people and enough market participants who are valuing it, that will not let it uh, let it hold any less value than what they are currently valuing it at. Interestingly, I'll try to end this at this point. I'll just read through this paragraph. This is the quote by Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin at the time. I think currently it's Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary of the US. I won't be talking about Bitcoin in 10 years. I can assure you that I would bet even in 5 or 6 years, I'm no longer talking about Bitcoin as Treasury Secretary. I'll have other priorities. I can assure you that I will personally not be loaded up on Bitcoin. Donald Trump, which interestingly is speaking at Bitcoin 2024, said this: I am not a fan of Bitcoin, which is not money and whose value is highly volatile and based on thin air. So the skeptic logic follows: Bitcoin does not work, but if it does work, the government will ban it. But governments in the free world will not attempt to ban Bitcoin until it becomes more apparent that it is a threat, at which time Bitcoin will be more valuable and undoubtedly harder to ban, as it will be held by far more people in far more places. So ignore fundamentals and the asymmetry inherent in a global monetization event, because in the event you turn out to be right, the government will step in to regulate Bitcoin out of existence. Yeah, so I'll just read this. So ignore fundamentals and the asymmetry inherent in the global monetization event, because in the event you turn out to be right, the government will step in to regulate Bitcoin out of existence. Which side of the fence would a rational economic actor rather be on? Owning a monetary asset that has increased in value so dramatically that it threatens the global reserve currency, or the opposite, not owning that asset? Assuming an individual possesses the knowledge to understand why it is a fundamental possibility and increasingly a probability, which is the more defensible and logical position? The asymmetry alone dictates the former, and any fundamental understanding of the demand for Bitcoin only reinforces the same position. Yep, I think it's a good enough argument that to the point that it threatens the biggest monopoly in the world, it gives enough reason for individuals to value it. And when it gives enough reason for individuals to value it, more and more individuals will be incentivized to preserve its properties. So it becomes an oxymoron that attack will reduce the value of Bitcoin by any degree. This is the Michael Goldstein is pretty famous for creating very classic memes and one-liners. This is one of them. Bitcoin is a strange game where the only winning move is to play. This is the asymmetry to which Bitcoin is yet to capitalize on. Bitcoin is competing with these monetary mediums, which is gold, USD M2, global M2, which is hundreds of orders of magnitude bigger than what Bitcoin is currently valued at. So it is left as a toy in the eyes of most power to be, and once it becomes enough of a value system that it threatens, there's enough value in the system to preserve it without letting those powers threaten it. Thank you for patiently listening to me. If somebody has any thoughts, comments, ruminations.
Hey, nice session, Shan. No questions as such from my end.
All right, if no questions or thoughts, thank you for joining, guys. I'll see you guys tomorrow in the session. I think every year is part of the cohort.